Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's such an honor to be here with all of you. I'm an educator in addition to being a reporter and a writer, so I just have a tremendous amount of respect for the work that you do and for you all being here and really engaging in questions of how to make strong educational experiences for the young people you work with. And it's really an honor to be here with the fellow writers, John, Omar, and Mbolo, who are just people I really admire. So I'm the author of a book called The Far Away Brothers, Two Young Migrants in the Making of an American Life. Excuse me, getting over a cough, so my apologies. Many of us may remember the media blitz of the summer of 2014 about unaccompanied minors. That year, we read and heard on the radio and we saw on the news that an unprecedented number of young migrants, mostly teenagers and mostly from Central America, were flooding across the southern border of the United States, and they were coming without papers and without their parents. And actually, the number of unaccompanied minors had been increasing dramatically over the past several years. So while they burst the infrastructure at the seams in 2014, it had been in a couple years where every year the number of these young paperless migrants who were crossing without their parents into the United States, it had been doubling for several years every year. The US government was scrambling to figure out how to catch up. They were trying to figure out how to feed these kids, how to house them and clothe them, and how on earth to fit them into already overcrowded immigration court dockets. The annual average of unaccompanied minors apprehended after crossing the border used to be about 7,000 a year. That was the historic annual average. In 2014, that number was nearly 60,000. While that was the highest number on record so far, we are still at historic highs with this past year, even after the so-called Trump effect, where there was a sense that migrants in general were crossing at lower numbers. We had about 35,000 unaccompanied minors cross into the United States. So this is still historic highs. I first began reporting on unaccompanied minors as a journalist in late 2012. I was writing a story for a magazine called VQR out of the University of Virginia, if anyone's from there, about the struggle of unaccompanied minors crossing into the Rio Grande Valley, which is just a few hours south of here, and the larger and increasingly overburdened bureaucratic apparatus surrounding these kids. I wanted to understand why so many of these young people were coming to the United States in the first place, and then once they got here, what awaited them. After that first story in VQR, I wrote another story for Vice magazine about unaccompanied minors who had fled brutal gang violence in Honduras and were now working in the California agricultural system. Excuse me. Every story I wrote provided me with answers, and that's why I write. That's why I became a journalist, to answer questions for myself and then to make sort of sense of them and ideally make meaning for my readers. But while these stories gave me answers, more than anything, they left me with more questions, and I kept wanting to write more and more about this issue. So in addition to writing, as I mentioned, I work at a school for newly arrived immigrant youth in Oakland, California. It's a under-resourced public school and has the highest number of low-income youth in all of Oakland. When my second feature story about unaccompanied minors was just about to go to print in Vice magazine, I was beginning to plan my next story, and then a coworker, my friend, Mr. David, came into my office and said, "Hey, we really need to do something about all these kids with upcoming deportation hearings." And I was like, what? It turned out that under my nose, while I was reporting on this issue throughout the country and doing all this research outside of the school, this place where I worked 4 days a week had all of a sudden, all of these young people had enrolled in our school. We did some research and found out that over 60 unaccompanied minors out of a school of just 400 had enrolled at Oakland International. Within 6 months, that number was at 90, and today, 4 years later, we have 127 unaccompanied minors out of a school of 400 kids. So my work at the school, where I coordinate support services for youth and families, basically transformed overnight once we learned this, because all of these young people needed lawyers. A lot of them needed mental health support. They were struggling to find housing and sort of care for themselves and figure out kind of how to set roots, but in the context of being about to be deported. So my work really transformed. Almost every day was spent trying to help them find therapists to support their challenges with trauma, and even more urgently, lawyers to help them fight their case. These lawyers, these kids are not provided lawyers by the government. So I've been to court and seen kids as young as 6 be in front of a judge by themselves. Through this work, I met the Flores twins, whose story comprises the bulk of my book, The Faraway Brothers. The Flores twins grew up in rural El Salvador in the wake of the Civil War, and they came of age in tandem with the rise of the region's brutal gangs. A lot of us have heard much about MS-13, which is a gang that, one of the gangs that has essentially a stranglehold over much of El Salvador, and that has a presence in the United States. Many of us don't know that it was a gang that was born in the United States and deported or exported to El Salvador. One of these young men ended up on the wrong side of a gang-protected big man in town and, fearing for his life, had to flee. And then soon after that, the other twin, who looks exactly like his older by 12 minutes brother, realized that he too was at risk because if his brother was going to be killed, he might be killed as well. So he, looking just like his brother, hit the road as well. The story follows their upbringing in El Salvador, their journey north toward the United States, and their attempts, which are often flailing and failing, to set up a life for themselves in the US under threat of death back home and of deportation in the United States. Like the Flores twins, the average unaccompanied minor coming to the United States is 16 or 17, which is just a little bit younger than the freshmen entering college, than most freshmen entering college. Like most college freshmen, the young men and women I write about in this book, where I write mostly about the Flores twins, but there are many other kind of characters and voices that come into the narrative. These, just like college freshmen, these young men and women share the concerns and preoccupation of early adulthood. They have romantic interests. They are obsessed with social media and pop culture. They want to look cool. They're worried about their grades. And they want to figure out who they are and who they want to become and how to get there. And yet the young people I write about are also managing really decidedly adult concerns. They're grappling with crippling debt back home. The young men I write about leave the country with $14,000 of debt. And within less than a year, even after paying several $100s a month, it's over $20,000 that they owe. And this was money that they took out in order to pay the smugglers for safe passage to the United States. They need lawyers to fight their case. They're afraid for their lives and the lives of their families back home. And they're worried their families might be killed by the local gangs that sent them running in the first place. Though this book is a book about migration, and it's a sympathetic portrait of 2 young men who happen to be immigrants, it's not a polemic about immigration policy. Instead, this book encourages all readers to try to put themselves in the place of the young men and women who, in unprecedented numbers, are fleeing endemic violence in their home countries and come to the United States. It is, at its core, a human story that encourages deep emotional engagement with the young men and women at the center of the current political debate on immigration, and who are often rendered voiceless within the political fray. In addition to being a book about immigration, it's a book about El Salvador and Central America. It's a book suited for a class on Latin American studies, for example. It provides a history of the Salvadoran War and of US intervention, and a story of the US history and foreign policy in Latin America. About half the book takes place in Oakland, California, where I live and work, or I live in Berkeley and work in Oakland. So it's also a book about urban issues and policies, in policies in poverty-stricken US cities like gangs and gentrification and poverty and homelessness. As a journalistic endeavor, this book can be taught in journalism classes. I was actually teaching in the January term course at Middlebury College, where we use this and many other works of journalism to talk about how we tell important human stories without making tropes of our characters or flattening them and their experience into mere stereotypes. The Faraway Brothers deals with issues of mental health as these young men who've experienced and witnessed unspeakable horrors both back in El Salvador and on the road grapple with their memories. It also deals with the sociology of gang violence and with issues of psychology and adolescent development. How do young people, this is a central question in this book, both for me as the writer and for these young men, how do young people who've been displaced especially develop their identity within the confines of society and their current circumstances? Like every young freshman entering college, these young men, these new Americans, are asking the question, how do I become the person I want to be? That is a central preoccupation. They come to the United States under extreme duress, but they want to figure out how to be themselves and their best selves. How do I carve out a future for myself, particularly in these challenging circumstances? And how do I make my dreams come true? Isn't that a question all of us asked when we were younger, and even still today? I certainly do. I remember asking these same questions as a young person entering college, and of course, long after that to today. As a literary studies major and a political science minor, I struggled with the question of how to try to do good work in the world and to make some contribution while also making myself happy. After years working with forced migrant communities out of a sense of responsibility for supporting those newest to our country to rebuild their lives, and also writing fiction on the side, sort of quietly, but doggedly, I came to journalism as a way to use language to tell important stories, to make meaning first for myself, like I was saying, and then for others of issues in society that I felt were pressing and vital to reckon with and to discuss. And that was the purpose of this book, for me to try to understand, first for myself and then for my readers, why it was that so many young people were suddenly leaving home without their families and with little more than a pocket full of change and a prayer. Anytime a whole group of people starts suddenly leaving home, we have to pay attention to why, and especially when those people are teenagers or sometimes even younger, going by themselves. More than anything, this book is a human story trying to make sense of a geopolitical mess. It is my hope that readers, and particularly young readers in the same age group as the Flores twins, can find some answers from this book about the state of the world, can launch some more questions for themselves that propel them on their own journeys, and to help us all kind of reckon with how we might incarnate something better. It's also a book about the role that empathy plays in this important work of being an engaged citizen and resident of the United States. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thanks to all my fellow authors. And Omar, welcome. Thanks.